after that. So the links between biodiversity and pandemics have been getting increased attention these last 18 months for obvious reasons. So to start, COVID-19 and other pandemics are rooted in biodiversity. They are caused by microorganisms that are a critical part of biodiversity and are themselves hosted and transmitted by diverse animal species, including humans. To this end, almost all pandemics of the modern era have been caused by diseases that have crossed from animals to people, also known as zoonosis. For example, HIV crossed from chimps to humans in the 1920s in what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo. Scientists believe that Ebola, the Ebola virus, is animal-borne, with bats or non-human primates being the most likely source. Zika was transmitted from monkeys to humans via mosquitoes. SARS likely came from palm civets in a Guangdong marketplace in China in 2002. And the emergence of novel strains of influenza have been linked to viral transmission among large poultry flocks, mixing with wild birds, pig herds, and people. Now, although diseases are often passed on by wildlife and other biodiversity, the drivers of that transmission are entirely anthropogenic environmental changes. Okay, we know that because of environmental destruction, the risk of pandemics is increasing. What we currently know is that 400 biodiversity-related disease microorganisms have emerged in people in the last 50 years. 70% of those originated in animals, and the others were from bacteria, fungi, and the like. The current estimate is that there are as many as 1.7 million undiscovered viruses circulating in the wild right now. Of those, up to half, that is 631,000 to 827,000 viruses, can spill over to humans and cause an isolated illness, an epidemic, or even another pandemic. The Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services has deemed this to be the start of an era of pandemics. Now, although diseases are, as I mentioned, often passed on by wildlife and other biodiversity, the drivers of that transmission are environmental changes. There are large-scale studies that show disease risk is highest in areas of human-altered landscapes because it causes closer contact between people, livestock, wildlife, and other biodiversity. These studies link the increased risk to specific land use changes, such as wildlife trade, agricultural intensification, deforestation, and climate change. Let me give you an example that you may be familiar with. Hendra virus. You might know that Hendra virus was passed from flying foxes to horses and then to people, but not many people are aware that GPS data from flying foxes has shown that the flying foxes in question were foraging in degraded vegetation, and so were more often found in garden or ornamental species in rural houses and in seasonally fruiting ficus, which is typically planted for stock shade and shelter. So on one hand, we have land use change via degradation of their habitat because of deforestation. And on the other hand, we have land use change via curated pastures and paddocks for horses and other livestock. Similarly, Marburg virus in Central Africa has been linked to land use change as a result of mining, and dengue fever is linked to urbanisation. This leads me to agricultural intensification. Viruses like influenza and Nipah virus have been passed indirectly from wild animals to livestock to people, pigs in the case of Nipah. In that case, the emergence of the disease was assisted by specific intensive methods of pig production that led to extended transmission periods over a 2-year period of time. Avian influenza or bird flu, which many of you would have heard of, resulted from intensification of poultry production because it was easier for the virus to spread and to mutate between the animals before being passed on to humans. Climate change is a big driver of pandemic risk. It influences wildlife population dynamics and distribution, bringing them into closer contact with people. For example, some tick-borne viruses have been linked directly back to the effects of climate change. And finally, the trade in wildlife is a particularly important risk factor for disease emergence because it provides that contact point between wildlife, farm animals, and humans. Increased volume of trade due to an increased consumption patterns in developed countries like ours, and the efficiency of long distance transport along the wildlife trade supply chain drive the movement of pathogens across large distances to contact populations that may not have had prior contact with them. Many diseases have been linked back to the wildlife trade, including COVID-19, Ebola, SARS, and MERS viruses. So clearly, environmental conservation and environmental law are very, very important when it comes to pandemic prevention. That is stopping the disease from spilling over into people and causing the type of chaos that we are currently seeing and have been experiencing since early last year. One way of focusing on those linkages between pandemic prevention and environmental law is through what is called a One Health approach. The approach starts with the acknowledgement that human health, animal health, and environmental health are all inherently linked. And so all sectors should be utilised in building pandemic preparedness and to enhance the ability to investigate and control outbreaks. Essentially, all three areas of health need to be considered together in all areas of decision making. So far, though, the One Health approach has been largely focused on the human and animal health side of things, and mostly those animals that are livestock and what is called peri-animals. So that's the animals that are domesticated or live in urban areas such as rats. The environmental part of that One Health triangle has been left behind. And so deep prevention of pandemics through those environmental drivers and through environmental conservation and environmental law is still a very novel concept. Now, on that note, after that introduction, I will ask the panelists to unmute themselves, please, and we will start discussing these issues with, I'll ask you to start with an introduction of your work as it relates to pandemic prevention. We'll start with you, Michelle.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Katie. So as Katie mentioned, I'm leading a new area at CSIRO called the Infectious Disease Resilience Mission. This is really looking at gaps and opportunities in COVID-19 and looking at how we can improve resilience to the next pandemic. So we're looking across the four pillars of the EcoHealth Alliance framework, the prevent, detect, respond, recover, and trying to build that system-wide approach so we can all play to our strengths and provide a much better response to infectious diseases and hopefully prevent some of the ones that could emerge and cause a problem in the future.
Thanks, Michelle. Elyse?
I think my information's a little bit more comprehensive than Michelle, so apologies if it goes for a little bit. So prevention and preparedness for exotic, environmental and established and emerging zoonoses is a critical function of the Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment in collaboration with the Department of Health and our state colleagues. So the team that I work in, the Environmental Biosecurity Office, it's only a couple of years old. It was established in October 2018, and we have been working very closely with our colleagues in the Office of the Chief Veterinary Officer, the One Health and Epidemiology teams and our environment colleagues to ensure that Australia can prevent, prepare for and respond to exotic and emerging pests, weeds and diseases that impact our unique natural environment, but also our social amenity. And this includes a number of wildlife diseases that are zoonoses, such as highly pathogenic avian influenza, bubonic plague, West Nile virus and rabies. And what's called the National Priority List of Exotic Environmental Pests, Weeds and Diseases complements a number of other priority lists, including listed human diseases that are the responsibility of the Department of Health and which now includes SARS-CoV-2, but also other influenza strains, and the national list of notifiable animal diseases. So the department manages pre and post-entry quarantine requirements for animals coming into the country, both from an environmental perspective via live import list assessments under the EPBC Act, Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, as well as import risk analyses and conditions under the Biosecurity Act. And that's actually quite important to recognise that there is multiple pieces of legislation at play here. And also because the Biosecurity Act in particular is what we use for the human biosecurity and human health side of things. So there's a number of onshore checks that we have at our disposal. That includes the post-entry quarantine facility at Mickleton in Melbourne, as well as premises regulated as approved arrangements. And that's our main gateway opportunities once animals have arrived in Australia to then check their health status and make sure that they meet our import requirements and are not sick. Some of you may also be aware that the department works very closely with the Department of Health and our state health and biosecurity agencies on border surveillance for disease vectors, particularly mosquitoes, around what we call first points of entry, which are airports and seaports. And that's because mosquitoes in particular can be vectors for diseases such as Zika, dengue, etc. So we've got a very strong role to play there. And we also manage international passenger and crew health clearances on the advice provided by our health colleagues. The importation of animal and biological products are also regulated due to the risks that they pose. So that includes genetic material for breeding purposes and health purposes as well. And most recently, of course, why I'm here in particular is that the Environmental Biosecurity Office has been collaborating on policy to strengthen how we can prevent pandemics, relating mostly to zoonoses spillover events. So, but there's also antimicrobial resistance and environmental pollutants such as lead contamination, and of course the impacts of climate change and changes in land use that Katie has talked about. So they're things that we are looking at as well. And we also recognise that the merger of the Agriculture and Environment departments in early 2020, as well as, of course, the increased awareness of pandemics and the importance of One Health as a result of SARS-CoV-2 pandemic, that we need to do more to strengthen our partnerships across government and researchers, in particular to take the One Health approach or concept to stronger practice. And as Katie noted, for us, it really is that environmental health element and bringing that in a lot more strongly. So yeah, that's the role that we have.
Thanks, Elyse. Chris, do you want to introduce your work as it relates to pandemic prevention?
Sure. So I have a background in veterinary science, and as a researcher, I've been working mainly in the public health space for the last 10 years or so. Through funding, through NHMRC and collaborations with a range of infectious disease physicians, policymakers, policy actors, and so on, we've put together a body of research which looks at and in some ways compares the perspectives of those actors on various dimensions of what One Health would mean. That includes people who are making decisions both in departments and also in hospitals, in surveillance systems, through to in local government and councils around infectious disease risks that might well have dimensions on them that also relate to how publics will respond. So there's been work with policymakers and policy actors, infectious disease physicians, and then quite a substantial amount of work engaging publics in deliberation around dilemmas that are posed by adopting One Health approaches, whether that's looking at questions around whether we should use environmental law and environmental controls to manage Hendra Virus risks, which has significant implications for land use and land holders, through to questions around managing AMR risks through regulation of antibiotic in the community and in agriculture. Also have explored, most pertinently, I guess, the public appetite for the heightened levels of surveillance that we're now experiencing through this pandemic, both in terms of the data that's collected on us, where we move, where we go, also through to how data drawn from us through microbial isolates. So when you go and have a PCR test and have a COVID test, which my son is probably having this very second, how that relates to your particular identity and how that's used in research, and then also used for public health response. So publics have much more sophisticated understandings of these things than they're often given credit for. And its position, obviously, that we take with that research program is that publics have a role to play both in the implementation of effective response, but also in forming those policies so that they meet their values and are more acceptable and legitimate in their eyes, which I think we're seeing with a lot of what's going on in Victoria at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. Elyse and Chris both mentioned AMR, antimicrobial resistance. I believe that's how you say it as a non-scientist. Michelle, as a scientist, can you explain to us what AMR is and how is it linked to environmental factors?
Yeah, sure, Katie. So antimicrobial resistance occurs when a drug is no longer able to inhibit or control the action of a microorganism that was previously sensitive to it. So that microorganism could be bacteria, fungus, virus, or a parasite. And as a result, medicines become ineffective and infections become increasingly difficult or impossible to treat. So this is really becoming a huge issue now. We're talking about COVID being an issue. I think AMR could potentially be our next big problem if we can't identify new antimicrobials to treat some of the things that are becoming resistant to our current antimicrobials. So there's a variety of factors such as pharmaceutical manufacturing, use of antimicrobials in human and veterinary medicine, which can result in environmental contamination. So this can be in waterways, sewage, soils and crops that get contaminated with antimicrobials and even antimicrobial resistant bacteria. So one example is animal manure, which is often used as a fertilizer for crops, can lead to contamination of the environment with antimicrobial residues or resistant bacteria, and this can actually lead to new resistant pathogenic bacteria, which have the potential then to be reintroduced into the human food chain or to clinical environments. And then you've got some antimicrobial resistant bacteria that we just potentially don't have a treatment for. So yeah, I guess the race is on to try and identify new antimicrobials that we can use in the future and to avoid this occurring.
Yeah, right. I mean, we're trying not to terrify everybody in the audience today, but unfortunately it's just the state of where we're at, right, with AMR and pandemic prevention generally. Now we know that the environmental realm is largely missing from One Health governance. I've mentioned it, Chris has mentioned it, Elyse has mentioned it, that the government's trying to kind of catch up in that respect. Have you also found this gap in your research practice relating to emerging infectious diseases? And if so, if there is an environmental gap in your own work and your practice, then what is the core focus if it's not the environment as a main driver of pandemic spillover or virus spillover? Chris, we'll start with you.
So from the perspective of veterinary science, so there's sort of the triad in One Health is animal health, human health, and environmental health. And the key professions which are usually associated with that, both in policy terms and the public imagination, are physicians, veterinarians, and ecologists or environmental health. But there's an incommensurability in how those different professions perceive the roles and importance of their respective roles in actually managing this magic thing that is a One Health existence, which is what we're trying to achieve. So from the work that we've done with both the medical profession and the medical side of things and the epidemiological side of things and the veterinary side of things, they tend to focus much more on what they're responsible for and their priorities than seeing these things as being part of a larger picture or a more holistic approach. So they would absolutely love for more ecologists to be involved in their work, but they struggle to understand how to incorporate that knowledge within the way that they practice and the way that they problem solve. So within the way that medicine is organised in infectious diseases, it's very much about the pathogen and the specificity of the diagnosis thereof, and then developing treatments and hopefully preventative measures. And it's those preventative measures which you start to think about environments and ecologies, but medical professionals and veterinarians are better at it because they deal with herd health as a sort of a more way of thinking about the world and the problems that they face. But they don't necessarily jump that bridge into the environmental determinants of how things spread and how things are passed or jump between species very easily. So for them, the buck sort of starts when the human gets infected, and then they start to think in public health terms. So, and then that public health mindset tends to override all other responses from that point forward. So I think to provide a short answer and a short summary of what I've said, I think there is great appetite now to include greater ecological perspectives and understandings within that model. But there is significant siloing and ways of understanding that are still very much fixed in that way of doing things, which need to be overcome, or ways need to be found to work more effectively, that sort of upstream knowledge, which can do so much to help us go down bad pathways into the way in which we deal with these approaches, with these problems.
Wonderful, thank you. Elyse, is the environmental realm missing from your perspective? I think you've mentioned that it is in terms of government practice, but have you found it to be specifically the case in relating to emerging infectious diseases?
Yeah, so within the, as Chris kind of indicated, within the veterinary and human health parts of the One Health spectrum, or triad, emerging infectious diseases have been a focus, and a very strong focus. And antimicrobial resistance is probably the most advanced issue that has been pursued, and progress is being made, both because of the criticality of it, as Michelle indicated, but also it's been one of those issues where it's resonated and people have actually understood really clearly what the implications of it are, and so it's kind of easier for people to grab onto something like AMR. But even my understanding is it took quite a while to get to where we are now. AMR as a concern has been around for decades, and we are, there's a lot of momentum now. So, for example, last year in November, Minister Lee, the Federal Minister for the Environment, was actually appointed to the first One Health Global Leaders Group on antimicrobial resistance. And that's a group that will promote urgent action to combat the threat of AMR worldwide. And when she was appointed, Lee said that she would be a strong advocate for awareness and global action to protect human health, animal health, and our natural environment. So there is very clearly a recognition there, but what that then translates into will be interesting to see. So there is a national AMR strategy, which has been expanded to focus on the environmental elements, and it is explicit in prioritising One Health collaboration. And there's a One Health Master Action Plan, which provides further guidance on implementation of that AMR strategy, and indicates which sectors, including the environment sector, need to be involved in implementing each of the focus areas. And there's an Australian Strategic and Technical Advisory Group on antimicrobial resistance, which does include representation from the environment sector, and that's a key means by which the Commonwealth Government can receive expert technical advice on AMR. But we don't have anything equivalent for any of the other kind of One Health concerns, so broader infectious disease kind of concerns, and certainly non-infectious diseases are also a significant issue within the One Health space. So, for example, there's been a lot of collaboration in the past around lead contamination, There was an incident, I think, in Western Australia where there was a significant bird mortality event that testing demonstrated that was a result of lead contamination. And actually that discovery ended up meaning that there was a greater understanding of the lead contamination risks to the population, human population. So the people who lived in that area and the children in particular. So that's actually a really good example of where a One Health approach from and the environmental health element from a non-infectious disease side of things is really important. And of course, those concerns can reduce the resilience that animals and people have to infectious diseases when they transpire. So there are a number of formal government mechanisms and informal government mechanisms. We work really closely with NGOs like the Wildlife Health Australia organisation, and also there's a sort of collaborative network at the officer level within the Commonwealth Government, but it's not senior officials, and it's more a networking kind of relationship building, keeping in touch with what's going on. And I think one of the things that Chris touched on that's really important, and it also goes to a later question you will have, which is how do we engage stakeholders where this is not something that they have been previously involved? How do we actually convince them this is important and their role is critical, and for them to dedicate time, resources and energy to One Health issues when it's not something that they have previously had to consider? And I think the workshops that you ran over the last few months, Katie, was a really fantastic example where the ecosystem side of things, representation from those members built over time and their understanding built. And by the end of it, they were all very well aware and much able to understand, hang on, we do actually have a really strong role to play in this space. So that's kind of the gaps that we have found and the core focus that we've got.
Right, yeah. Thank you for bringing up that workshop. I haven't talked about that yet, but of course, all of the panel members that you are seeing here today, including myself, we all participated in a series of workshops over the last few months to bring together those three different pinnacles of that One Health triangle and to see what we can do to increase that environmental aspect in One Health in federal policy. So stay tuned for that policy information. It's coming very soon. But I should throw back to you quickly, Michelle, to see those were very comprehensive answers. Is there anything else you can add around how the environmental realm is missing from One Health as you've seen it in your work within CSIRO?
Yeah, I guess Elyse and Chris have really made some fantastic points. I guess as a scientist, I've got expertise in emerging infectious diseases, and scientists generally tend to work in their silos. They work in their area of expertise. I think there's much more recognition now that we need to be much more multidisciplinary. With things like COVID, we were very heavily involved in some of the vaccine testing and very much focused on the virus itself. People have really been working to their strengths, I guess, and we just really need to be conscious that we really do need things to be much more multidisciplinary. People are often only working on the human health aspect or the virus aspect or where the virus has come from. I think we need to be much more conscious of that environmental aspect, particularly when we're thinking about things like a reservoir host. So I'm particularly interested in bats and viruses and zoonotic disease. So, I mean, although we're starting to understand that bats carry a number of different viruses and potentially that's where SARS-CoV-2 came from, we really still don't understand what the triggers for spillover are, and that could be something environmental. So I think we really need to bring all of that together, and I think it's just great that there is greater recognition now that we really do need to build that environmental aspect into some of these things that we're looking at. Thank you.
Chris, I want to return to you because you said some really interesting things around how practitioners in the One Health space and from veterinary and medical sciences have struggled to see the role of ecological and environmental practitioners. And I think up until now, and probably still even now, ecological and environmental practitioners also have struggled to see their role in a One Health space. This is a hard question, but what is their role? Have you given any thought, or has there been any research done around what that role is and how to integrate that role into the One Health approach?
So if you're thinking about emerging infectious diseases, then the key role that they would have is to understand the conditions that prompt, as Michelle was just describing, the conditions that prompt emergence. So what is it that actually changes within a context, which then means that sorry, there's dogs now barking behind me, and it's just bonkers.
We understand working from home is hard.
It's lockdown central. So, which actually prompt a spillover event. So the way in which veterinary science and medicine have always dealt with these issues is to think epidemiologically and think in terms of this factor or that factor, which one is a causal determinant and which one is a correlative determinant, and some sophisticated models and maybe an epidemiological study, without actually really understanding the system and how those factors actually have things that are happening underneath them, which aren't immediately recognizable to them, that might actually be driving those processes, which are then leading to spillover events. So I think what the role that ecology and that type of expertise and environmental understanding environmental systems can have is to actually deepen the extent to which we can understand spillover events as being contextualized by much larger processes, or even just small triggers that aren't immediately obvious to someone who's working in a more public health space. So in terms of prevention, it's obviously much more likely that they can have an understanding, because prevention in veterinary science and in human medicine is about infection control. It's about stopping jumping between species and putting barriers between species and siloing off populations from each other to understand and prevent infection. But it's not really about stopping that, the conditions which make that more likely in terms of the climate, in terms of land use change, in terms of how you might mix different concentrations of species or different practices. So as much as anthropology is kind of now being brought into these discussions around human behaviours and human practices and human cultural conditions, I think there's a growing recognition that ecology should also have deep insights into the more minutiae of how systems work and organisms interact in ways that promote or inhibit transfer of pathogens that we don't want jumping between species for obvious reasons.
You said that we haven't got that, the drivers in terms of climate change and agricultural intensification aren't really within the One Health paradigm. I'd just like to say, not yet. We're working on it though, aren't we? As a group, we're working on getting there.
There are some really, so with Hendra Virus as an example, so One Health kind of kicks in underneath climate change and underneath land use change. If you look at causal, they've done some really neat causal webs, and One Health thinking seems to start well below those really fundamental processes. So that's, I think, the work that you're leading is bringing that to the attention of policymakers and hopefully introducing a set of regulatory frames around those key processes, which we know are causing most of what we're now experiencing.
Yeah. Well, we'll keep our fingers crossed, and I'll keep working hard to try to get to there. But in the meantime, I want to talk about One Health again as a concept and a paradigm, because, it's really about this connection between people and the land and animals and everyone around us, right? And everything around us. And it's really bears striking resemblance to First Nations laws and First Nations culture. And I wanted to ask you, Elyse, we've often discussed the relevance of First laws and the inclusion of Indigenous knowledges in law and policy around pandemic prevention. Can you explain a little bit about why this is important to disease and wildlife monitoring, and how the department is encouraging collaboration and knowledge sharing in the Indigenous Ranger program, for example?
Yeah, so firstly, I would like to preface my response by making it clear that I in no way speak for or on behalf of any First Nations peoples on this matter, and I am going to be drawing from work done by others that I understand has involved extensive collaboration and knowledge sharing to come to the conclusions and to sort of, design the programs in question. So on the environmental biosecurity side of things, one of the most integral and critical elements is the role that individuals in the community play, and in particular, individuals and communities that understand their landscape, understand their environment really closely. So First Nations land managers and rangers are really key stakeholders. Natural resource management organisations, community groups like land care, weeding groups, they're all also really important because they're the organisations and they're the individuals and the people who can see the changes in their landscape, can see the changes in the animals. So whether it's a formalised surveillance monitoring program or it's what we call citizen science, which is just, keeping an eye out and submitting a report to relevant kind of hotlines or websites about changes in condition and changes in health status, that's all really, really important. And we are certainly in the department, the environment side is arguably much more mature in its engagement and collaboration with First Nations peoples on a range of different issues around recovery programs, threatened species, conservation management, parks management, etc. And how we protect the environment must take into account obligations and responsibilities under a range of international agreements and legislative powers, so the Convention on Biological Diversity and things relating to Indigenous knowledge sharing. But what we're doing is we're seeking to protect more, or extending that protection to the tangible and intangible values, such as living Indigenous heritage, sites of significance, cultural values, as well as ecological values when it comes to considering what the impacts of exotic pests, weeds and diseases might be should they arrive in Australia. So historically, biosecurity has had a really significant agricultural and human health focus. Understandably, that's what was of concern at the time, that a lot of these laws were first kind of considered many, many centuries ago. And there is a relatively good understanding of the threats and impacts of agriculture pests and diseases, and really well-tried arrangements for working with agricultural industries and stakeholders. However, as you kind of noted, in the biosecurity space, Indigenous participation and involvement has really largely only been through surveillance programs, particularly that Indigenous Biosecurity Ranger program in Northern Australia through what we call the Northern Australia Quarantine Strategy, or NARCS. And that's Indigenous rangers on mainland Australia and also in the Torres Strait. And we're really just starting to recognise, I feel a bit kind of sad to some extent that we're only now just really starting to recognise that we can and should be doing a lot more in the south. And engaging and encouraging and supporting the participation and enabling the participation of Indigenous ranger groups and land manager groups to use the biosecurity system that we have and all of the different mechanisms and measures that we have at play to be able to support them to care for their country and to protect their country and their culture and their values in a way that they deem most appropriate. So we are working very closely with a number of stakeholders in state governments, Indigenous ranger groups and natural resource management groups. And I mention them because NRMs often have Indigenous liaison program officers and project officers, and they've got really strong relationships with their local communities as well, and they're all over the country. And, we're working to set up some pilot programs about how to build capacity and capability around environmental biosecurity for those land managers, but also we have worked with the NARCS program to actually expand the scope of their most recent biosecurity business grants round to include eligible activities being the development of biosecurity risk mitigation or management plans that protect Indigenous values in a local area. So it's about more bringing the focus back to what is it that those Indigenous ranger groups want to protect, not just what we as the Australian government want them to protect and do surveillance for. So this is a really significant priority for the Environmental Biosecurity Office and the department more broadly. We have identified a really significant number of gaps, weaknesses and challenges in our current approaches, and that does include for disease and wildlife surveillance and monitoring, as I noted, also considering the impact and consequence of biosecurity risks and being able to properly incorporate Indigenous values and land management responsibilities in priority setting and response arrangements. When you are caring for your country, you obviously also want to be involved in those response and recovery activities should they be required. And we really want to understand better what is of value to First Nations peoples in living systems and landscapes that can be degraded as a result of exotic pests and weeds coming in it. And this includes the impact that wildlife diseases might have, for example, or even more indirectly, like where you have plant pests or diseases that might come in and affect the habitat of animals that are have significant cultural focus for particular groups, so totem animals and even just animals that, you know, the dreaming stories and the songlines mention when they disappear, that really changes what those stories and what that dreaming can mean. So I kind of noted before with regards to ecologists and the environmental stakeholders that it can be really challenging to actually engage with individuals and groups that haven't actually been a part of this work previously, and that's something that we have found. And we recognise that we may not actually be taking the best approach to actually seeking the collaboration and the knowledge sharing in a way that resonates with First Nations stakeholders. And that's something we need to re-evaluate because it is actually really challenging to... There's also, I guess, only so many First Nations representatives that we are aware of that we look to call on to work with us on these issues and to help improve our understanding. And they're also often the stakeholders that are called on by many others for the same sorts of things. And there's, you know, engagement fatigue, and they just don't have the time, the energy, the inclination to understand what it is that we are after, because it's a priority of ours and not necessarily a priority of theirs. So we need to do a lot better, and by we I mean government needs to do a lot better to support more Indigenous and First Nations individuals and groups to be able to engage with us and to be able to collaborate with us, not because they can see that it's important, not just because we are asking them to.
Thank you. That was really comprehensive. And I have a couple of follow-up questions. They might be a little bit difficult and you might not be able to answer them, but we'll see how we go. You mentioned that, you know, there's programs like the Citizen Science Program and the Indigenous Ranger Program in Northern Queensland, and they're kind of community-based or natural resource management policies, right? So they're policies, they're not within law. There's issues with engagement, probably a lot. I mean, again, I can't speak for Indigenous people, but I'd say a lot has to do with the fact that there's a lot of other outside issues going on around environmental protection and cultural protection and things that the government hasn't provided in that response. So is there more from your perspective? Is there more that the law can be doing here to help that? I mean, the department and you personally and everyone in the department is doing great work here, but is it going to be better off if it's supported by law? And the reason I'm asking this is because I know I've studied, natural resource management policies, and it's really hard to keep up those ground level policies when they're not supported institutionally, or if they're only supported institutionally in the way that the institution wants to support them and not in the way that the people at the ground want the policies to be supported. So is there something that the law can be doing better there? Is that something you can answer?
I was going to say, look, again, I'm not in a position to speak for First Nations peoples and whether it is something that they believe would make a difference. What I can say is that the Samuel review of the EPBC Act did propose that the implementation of the recommended national environmental standards for Indigenous engagement and participation in decision making would ensure that Indigenous Australians that do speak the country have the opportunity to do so, and that their views and knowledge would be explicitly considered in decisions in a culturally respectful and transparent way. Now, the Australian government has introduced amendments to the EPBC Act, including new national environmental standards that reflect the existing EPBC Act requirements. And that does include that environmental assessment and approval decisions and arrangements and processes provide adequate opportunity for the engagement and input of governments, the community landholders and Indigenous Australians consistent with the EPBC Act. So when it comes to biosecurity, so there's kind of, I guess, a recognition there that more explicit, because those national environmental standards would be legislated in accordance with Samuel, his recommendations. Now, again, I would also like to say, while that work is also being progressed within the department that I work for, I am not speaking on behalf of the environmental assessments and reforms area. I am coming to this from a biosecurity perspective. I think we have opportunities to be able to strengthen how we engage and incorporate Indigenous knowledge. And I think it's kind of a chicken and egg situation where unless we have participants that understand and are supported and enabled to be able to also fulfill those potentially legislated requirements and responsibilities, and that could be a driver for better supporting and enabling that capability and that capacity. We're going to be in a similar sort of, I guess, challenging environment that we have at the moment, which is it's very, free and informed consent is absolutely imperative. There are some other examples. I can't remember the name of the legislation. It's Queensland legislation around like biological assets. So when you're going out and going onto state lands and looking for new things, new natural assets that could be used in medications or whatever it might be, but there is actually a legislated engagement, not even engagement, legislated permission that you need from the Indigenous group. So there's and obviously when it comes to land rights and those sorts of things, there's a lot of legislative permissions that are already kind of incorporated. So there's things that we can look to take guidance from, but whether it ends up being appropriate and desired in this particular context, it would be interesting to explore. It's certainly something that should be considered, I think.
Thank you. I think, you've mentioned, now that you've mentioned the Samuels review and the amendments or the attempted amendments to the EPBC Act at this point in time by the federal government. I mean, this year, the speakers that we've had in the NELA seminars have talked at length about the state and federal government attempts to change environmental laws. We've talked a lot about the Samuels review. We've also talked a lot about how those attempts to change environmental laws and environmental protections look a lot like scaling back of environmental law and environmental protections. And some of those legal changes have been made in direct response to the pandemic, right? Because we had the federal government initially come out and say that their plan for economic recovery was a gas-led recovery, for example. And if you couple that with the plans and attempts to cut green tape in our environmental legislation, it does appear that when we're looking at pandemic prevention from an environmental conservation point of view, it does appear that we're heading in the wrong direction here. So I'll ask the panelists, and I'll ask you, I won't ask you specifically, but just jump in if you have any thoughts about this. In your view, how is there scaling back of Australia's environmental laws? You might not agree that that's the case, but if you do, how will the scaling back of Australia's environmental laws affect pandemic prevention, both here in Australia and overseas? Does anyone want to have a go at answering that?
I'm happy for Michelle or Chris to go first. I've been talking for a while.
Chris, do you have any thoughts?
You can't say that I do have anything that leaps to mind, really. I think the tension between how it's difficult to imagine how you are going to change the way in which environmental laws work around land use change without significant political heat. To do with the settler colonial logics which underpin how our governments have come in and established ways of managing land use, and also because there are going to be landholders who can't do extract what they want to extract from their property in the way in which they assumed when they actually took possession of that land. I'm not aware of how they are being scaled back, so if you provided a little bit more detail, perhaps I could respond a little bit more appropriately, or Michelle or Elyse might want to leap in at this stage and add some much needed detail. So.
I will certainly get to there, but just quickly, Michelle or Elyse, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I certainly don't have the background in this area either as a scientist, but I just broadly speaking, I mean, all the things that we're talking about in terms of changes to the environment are going to have an impact on pandemic prevention. If there's changes to deforestation, land use, climate change, it all affects wildlife and interaction between wildlife, humans and animals. So I think it's something that we really need to think about. But I'll hand over to Elyse. I'm sure she has some much more information and can provide some context around the actual scaling back of the laws.
I'm not sure I can provide context on the purported scaling back of the laws. Careful language there. What I do, there are a few things that I do want to know, and one of them is that we actually need to remember that pandemic prevention actually doesn't only rely on environmental regulation for the contextual kind of regulatory environment, but also on public health measures and education, biosecurity, prevention, preparedness and response, and of course in just managing risks more generally. And certainly COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2 has increased awareness of the risk of zoonosis spillovers and the drivers for those zoonosis spillover events, and how they can result in becoming a pandemic as a result to just an outbreak or even an epidemic. And by all accounts, we have in fact been quite lucky in Australia to date that while we have quite a number of zoonoses, and we have spillover events, and this has occurred for diseases such as Hendra Virus, psittacosis in parrots, Elyse virus, Q fever, and a number of others. They have not resulted in widespread outbreaks or in epidemics, and absolutely certainly not in pandemics. And that's partly because in order to get to those levels, there's a number of other criteria that need to be met, and thankfully in Australia, we have not yet had those. But that's partly because we are really well placed when it comes to public health and biosecurity to support our citizens both domestically, but also in your question around internationally, overseas, We actually do a lot of work to support our new neighbours and others that might require assistance to outbreaks, but also preventative and preparedness measures. So, for example, a number of Australian medical professionals went to West Africa to assist with the Ebola outbreaks that occurred there over a number of years, and unfortunately there are still more popping up. And the department actually partners with other countries and organisations to improve the early detection, preparedness and response, as well as recovery options for emerging and infectious diseases. There's a particular focus on rabies in our region. So through the World Organization for Animal Health, or the OIE, we've provided assistance for an anti-rabies vaccine bank that can be used by some of the world's poorest countries, and we've provided direct support to Papua New Guinea and Timor-Leste to stay free from rabies through assistance with response strategies, improving diagnostic capacity and surveillance, and the development of national rabies management plans. And we've also worked very closely with the Indonesian Ministry of Agriculture to improve the management of emerging infectious diseases in general. And that's included simulation exercises to test and control strategies for diseases like rabies. And we're also working very closely with a number of our neighbours in the Pacific to improve their biosecurity capabilities and capacities. And I guess emerging infectious diseases isn't necessarily a focus on some of that work. So it does go back to what are some of those other environmental drivers, what are some of the other pressures that might be being placed on animals and ecosystems that could decrease resilience and increase stresses, and therefore create a circumstance where there's a greater likelihood that an infectious disease and zoonosis spillover in particular could become problematic.
Thank you. Let's then go back to the science. I mean, in the absence of scientific evidence, Australia's decision makers under environmental laws around the country are required to exercise precaution in making decisions, for example, under the EPBC Act and under our state-based environmental laws. Unfortunately, though, and we've mentioned this a little bit, but I'd like to go into a bit more detail, when it comes to the science around antimicrobial resistance and zoonotic spillover and the drivers behind zoonotic spillover, there remains a lot of uncertainty. So it makes it difficult for decision makers to make decisions when that uncertainty is present. Can you provide some examples of where that uncertainty lies, Michelle?
Yeah, sure. I guess from my perspective, I'm most interested in bat-borne viruses, zoonotic viruses that emerge from bats. And I guess we don't really do any surveillance for zoonotic viruses in Australia. We really don't do ongoing surveillance of our bat populations, for example. We know that bats are moving more frequently into urban areas, so that causes a lot of issues with people, a lot of conflict with people not necessarily wanting bats in their backyard. And we don't really have a good handle on the different viruses that might be carried by bats. Of course, we know that they carry Hendra Virus, flying foxes, Australian bat virus, and there's recommendations around not coming into contact with bats, but there's no ongoing surveillance of different bat colonies to really assess what the risk is. And we don't really understand what the triggers for spillover, which we've touched on already today. And it's really seen as a bit of an insurance policy. So spillover events don't occur very often in Australia. We've got Hendra Virus, which emerges annually, but it doesn't generally cause a huge issue. So it's not something that there's a heavy focus on, but I think we really need to understand more about what viruses might be a problem in the future, particularly as there is much greater interaction between, for example, bats, humans, and domesticated animals.
Great, thanks. Chris?
Yeah, so I've actually done a comparative Delphi study with colleagues at the University of Singapore, looking at how different sectors, so veterinary decision makers and public health decision makers, respond to a syndromic event. So we had a scenario which we developed, which could be applied in both Australia and Singapore, which was about a respiratory virus which was infecting birds, and there were there's an uptick in human cases of an unknown respiratory virus, with some dead bird carcasses around. And it was interesting that when you analysed responses, that in Singapore there was a greater sense of precaution than in Australia, and that was put down to their, at that time, much greater exposure to global pandemics, because they got SARS, they got bird flu to a much greater extent than we did. They also had Nipah virus than the Australian practitioners. And we also were able to discern that there were two ways in which the logics which underpin decision making. And there was where precaution is used as an epistemic rule. So your idea of acting cautiously in an uncertain scenario was to make sure that your science was solid before you did anything that which was going to disrupt systems in ways in which we've all become very used to now. The idea that you could lock down Melbourne or Sydney was a complete anathema to the way anyone was actually thinking about managing pandemic risks 2 years ago. So there was epistemic rules where the precaution was going to be applied to evidence. And then there was the way in which it was a decision rule, which meant that you should imagine the worst scenario and act cautiously to try and prevent that happening. And the breakdown at that time, and this survey was done in 2016 and 17 in both settings, was that about 2/3 were using it as an epistemic rule, so wanted to be driven by hard evidence before those decisions were made. And about 30 to 40% were much more attuned to the idea that actually we should act cautiously towards uncertainty to prevent bad outcomes, the worst outcome that we can have. If you were to run this process now with a similar scenario, I would be very curious to know which way people would fall. But I guess it kind of points to the way in which public health and veterinary public health are very much oriented towards sustaining systems of economic activity and social activity, and were geared not to disrupt that unless it was absolutely had to be done. And I think there would be a radical shift now in how that thinking would be done and how precaution would be applied in those circumstances. How that applies to environmental law, I think you'd find much more interest in developing environmental protections to stop those types of scenarios occurring amongst those audiences now than you would have 2 or 3 years ago, definitely.
Let's hope so. Elyse, did you have anything to add on the scientific uncertainty?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's probably 3 main points that I'd like to make here. The first is that as decision makers, we're always making decisions in the absence of complete certainty. This is particularly the case when it comes to dealing with new and emerging pests and diseases. So sort of do have to take the best guess and, you know, see what happens as a result of what you decide to do. Secondly, something that's actually quite interesting is that the EPBC Act legislates the use of the precautionary principle, while the Biosecurity Act actually legislates both what's called the appropriate level of protection, which is sort of governed by the World Trade Organization as a concept, also known as the ALOP, and also meeting our obligations and requirements under the Convention of Biological Diversity. So I'm going to be overly simplistic here, but essentially the EPBC Act and precautionary principle is a no unless yes approach to decision making, and ALOP is a yes unless no approach. And they are obviously fundamentally incompatible when it comes to making decisions that on the same issue, but where you actually do have to balance decisions under those 2 pieces of legislation. So that's just kind of an interesting observation, and it is something that we are trying to work through, but it is quite challenging. And the other thing, the last thing I'd kind of like to just note is that the EPBC Act is actually not designed to prevent AMR or zoonotic disease spillover or to prevent pandemics. It is designed to enable Australia to meet its requirements in implementing the Convention on Biological Diversity by providing a legal framework to protect matters of national environmental significance, but also to provide the legal framework and the decision-making process for ecologically sustainable development. So that's probably, and just kind of in response to some of the things that Michelle and Chris have mentioned as well. So we are actually currently investing in a couple of really specific projects to help improve our knowledge and understanding of wildlife health impacts and outcomes. So there's a wildlife health research development and extension roadmap that is being developed sort of through the University of Melbourne vet pool, but hopefully we'll have more of a One Health kind of perspective to it. There's also a wildlife health surveillance program with a really strong social science element to it that's being delivered by the Charles Sturt University, and that's out of the vet school there. But again, there's a really strong One Health component to it. And there's also a project that we're working with academics at University of Western Sydney on what's called white nose syndrome. And this is a disease that affects cave-dwelling bats, particularly bats that hibernate. It does not occur in Australia. It's a fungal disease, but there is a risk of accidental importation. We actually don't know what the impacts of this disease could be if it was to come into the country, what the impacts on the bat populations might be, how susceptible different species of bats might be. It includes risk species, include the southern bent-winged bat, which is a threatened species. But we have, despite all of this uncertainty, we actually have quite strong biosecurity requirements that have been put in place, triggered by a international caving convention a few years ago. So we had hundreds, if not thousands, of delegates coming to Australia, and we basically said, do not bring any of your own gear. You will be lent gear while you are in Australia, or you can go buy a new gear if you're here, if you're so inclined. Do not bring any of your gear, because the risk of your gear being contaminated with white nose syndrome, fungal spores, and then that being spread into the bats habitat that we have here in Australia, that risk actually was one we weren't willing to take. So that was one that we knew, and so there's ways to work with that appropriate level of protection side of things to kind of go, even when there is uncertainty, if we know enough, we can have some fairly stringent conditions in place. So the other thing that I probably note is that the biosecurity legislation in particular is quite strong at different points in time. So it always falls back to appropriate and proportionate, how you make decisions on how to respond and how to manage biosecurity risks. And this is for the human biosecurity side of things as well as the ostensibly the animal biosecurity. So there's what are called emergency declaration powers in the Act, and they're the powers that are being used at the moment for the human health international arrivals and departures side of things for COVID. So people might remember that a few months ago, when there was the initial Delta outbreak getting worse in India, that there was, the condition imposed that people could not return to Australia from India or from a third country if they had been in India for 14 days prior. So, and there's fines and jail time that can arise if you fail to meet those legislative conditions. So the animal side of things has actually a lot more powers available to it. And Chris, it's interesting that you note that the economic side of things is something that always tends to be weighed up. And one thing I will note is that industry in particular are often very happy. They may not be particularly enthusiastic, but they are actually usually very happy to undertake whatever biosecurity kind of control requirements are required to be able to get through and come out the other side. And we exercise biosecurity things every so often. One of the main ones is actually what's called a livestock standstill. So there are powers that all the states have where the movement controls can be put on the transportation of any livestock, and that can be from, between paddocks, between communities, between sale yards, abattoirs, all those sorts of things. Basically, trucks stop. Nothing is moved anywhere until more certainty can actually be garnered to then make more decisions about what to do. And it does seem that a lot of our zoonoses and infectious diseases like to hit us on a Friday afternoon. I believe equine influenza was a weekend special.
Yep.
And it was very fortunate that they had the laboratory kind of equipment expertise. New South Wales had it at the time to be able to actually analyse the samples while samples were being sent to what's now the Centre for Disease Preparedness and Control. Is that right? CDPC. So yes, there's a really fine balancing act that needs to be played there.
Right. Thank you. I think I just want to wrap up with a very quick question, a very quick turnaround question in terms of, I think, Elyse, the fact that you mentioned that the EBBC Act and ALOP are fundamentally incompatible in terms of the precautionary principle and how they operate, or the fact that there is no precautionary principle in ALOP is very concerning. Is there one change in Australia's environmental laws that you would like to see happen, and is it important to pandemic prevention? Very quickly. Michelle?
Oh, absolutely.
Oh, sorry, I'll start with Elyse. Go for it. You're going.
I promise I will be quick. I've sort of mentioned it just before, but I would personally like to see a greater emphasis on improving the health and health status of our wildlife species and ecosystems. There's a value assessment that we're currently undertaking, but we basically, just having healthy wildlife not only has a whole lot of benefits around pandemic prevention, but it also has a whole lot of other benefits to our economy, our way of life, and those sorts of things. So that's definitely something I would like to see more explicitly considered.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Michelle?
Yeah, I guess just making sure that we maintain adequate habitat for wildlife. I mean, they're constantly moving into urban environments. I mentioned the bats. I mean, Canberra's got a lovely bat population. Geelong's got a lovely bat population right next to our lab. That's great, but we need to make sure that they've got adequate habitat so we can minimise our contact with them potentially.
Yeah. Thank you. Chris?
Both of those things, I think, are important. So the habitat and not just healthy animals in zoos.
Absolutely. I think to wrap up, we have a few things going for us right now in Australia, right? Up until recently, up until the last few weeks, we had comparative control of the spread of the virus, so we could turn our minds to prevention of the next pandemic or the next virus. Obviously, the last few weeks have thrown a bit of a spanner in the works there. But in addition to that, we have the ongoing EBBC Act reform and the Samuels Review, which has taken a slow start in terms of actual change, but in which many of the recommendations align with the transformative change that's kind of required for us to move towards pandemic prevention in Australian environmental law. In particular, measurable health indicators, as you've mentioned, I think, Elyse, especially measurable environmental health indicators have been recommended in the report and could be implemented in the national environmental standards recommended by the Samuels Review when they get off the ground. In addition to these big ticket items, there are many other policy goals and recommendations that various institutions have made. They cover the ambit of building high-level enabling mechanisms to assess and set targets for and reduce pandemic risk by increasing sustainability and reducing land use change and agricultural expansion, bridging critical knowledge gaps, and fostering the involvement of all sectors of society in reducing pandemic risk. What environmental practitioners should do, what environmental lawyers should do, is to add pandemic prevention and everything you've learned from our wonderful panelists to your list of tools to use in discussing and advocating for environmental protection. And hopefully we can start to utilise this pandemic for deep transformative change to prevent the next one. And with that, I will thank the panelists. We have 10 minutes or so left for questions, and I have a few coming into my chat, so I will quickly have a look at those. I've got a question that says, a former NELA webinar presenter, Associate Professor Robert Niven, who works in land contamination, suggested that administrative arrangements need to change to enable an effective governance response to land contamination prevention, response and rehabilitation. He suggested that the Departments of Health and the Department of Environment should be combined and parallel standards abandoned. What do you think of this panel? I'll start with you, Chris, because this seems to be very much within your realm of knowledge.
So, yeah, the interest and benefits of kind of ripping up structures and starting again are massive. But the problem you've got is when you try and merge things, there's too much embedded tradition and embedded power structures and embedded position within the Department of Health and the Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment, that what you do when you try and bring them together is often you just get a lot of talk about the benefits of merging and combining approaches without actually much happening around what would be required to get those benefits. So, so I'm all for radical reforms when the need is there, but you need to offset those against what do you lose through doing that. And those sort of interagency collaborations can work very, very well, but you need the right types of communication and you need power sharing and honest ways of negotiating and brokering that sharing for it to really work really well. And there are examples where it has worked, but intersectoral action is usually a nice slogan and everyone gets on board, but it rarely actually works unless you really do have that root and branch reform and the right leaders within those spaces to make it work. So yes, please, to either, but it has to be done in a way which really will produce outcomes and not just more papers.
Yeah, they're really good points, and I think what we should be seeing is a One Health structure that sits above those departments and has that culture that flows down into those departments. That would be, you know, the ultimate goal. Elyse, I wanted to ask you, because the department has already gone through restructure. It's already massive because it's not just the Department of Environment anymore, it's the Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment, which is actually beneficial for a One Health paradigm because you already have that merging of two of the fundamental pinnacles of One Health. How difficult would it be to incorporate the Department of Health into that?
I think it would be more challenging than some people might realise, and the reason why I say that, not because I don't think there are some fantastic improvements and benefits that would arise, but simply because there's probably more differences between the functions of the Department of Health beyond a One Health spectrum than there are similarities, and so there would be a lot of challenges just associated with, you know, aged care and tobacco and, you know, those sorts of public health initiatives and policies and programs that are really important and obviously have a link in with One Health, but aren't within the realm of what we're really talking about here. The other thing that I would probably note is, as I indicated before, there's currently not actually even a senior officials kind of forum within the organisations, which I think should include researchers like Chris and Michelle and their counterparts across the country, to actually bring the minds that need to be considering One Health perspectives in the work that they are trying to progress, and actually, you know, having a forum that enables that to occur. So I would want to see that before we go anywhere near another machinery of government change, which for any federal public servant is just constant trauma.
Of course. Michelle, I'm going to quickly ask you, because you are dealing with in your the infectious disease resilience mission that you're building, you are dealing with each of these three different pinnacles, right? And trying to bring them together. How difficult is that?
Well, actually, I just wanted to bring up another really good example that I think highlights how we can work together, and that's the Centre for Health Security in DFAT. So that's was just a centre. I actually was seconded to the centre back when it first started in 2018, and started with about 12 people. They're actually now turning into a division. I think there's over 50 people, but they're all around improving the ability of countries in the Indo-Pacific region to respond to infectious disease threats. So they have a great model in that they have some core DFAT staff, but they also have secondees from different departments. So they have Department of Health, Department of Ag, ASIA, they're secondee from CSIRO, they have NH and MRC, and that's really a good way of bringing expertise into one centre, and it really works well, and they really are thinking very carefully about One Health. They're actually doing their new strategy for the next iteration of the centre, and One Health is a clear component of that. So I'd say that rather than merging departments, I think that is a really good example of how a division could work, bringing that expertise in from different places.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. Thank you for that very much. I'm just looking through the other comments, and they do seem to be comments, not questions. Matt says, FYI, Part 8A of the EPBC regulations provides for the control of access to biological resources in Commonwealth areas. Kirsty has provided a great view of flying foxes across Australia, however, is often data deficient, and a link to a website. Does anyone have any other questions that they'd like to ask the panelists before we wrap up? You can unmute yourself if you would like to ask a question. Okay, well, thank you so much, Michelle, Elyse, and Chris. Thank you for coming along to be our last panel for our the National Environmental Law Association's conference. And thank you to everybody for coming along and participating throughout the last 4 weeks. Hannah, did you have anything you wanted to add to wrap up?
No, thanks. It was fabulous.
Great. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for coming.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
It was good fun. Thanks.